Hancock County, Indiana, April 1889. While neighboring farm wives planted kitchen gardens at ground level and tended to spring preserves, Margaret Ashford stood beside an 8-foot pit that her two sons had been excavating for 3 weeks adjacent to her farmhouse foundation. The widow was directing construction of what Thomas Brennan called a grave for good money, a sunken pantry requiring $47 in materials when standard root cellars cost $12 and served farm families perfectly well. Margaret's investment represented nearly 4 times the conventional expense, and her construction timeline had already consumed the prime planting season, while neighbors finished their garden work and moved on to field preparation. The dimensions told the story of her unconventional approach. 10 feet by 12 feet of underground space, stone-lined walls requiring careful masonry work, dual ventilation shafts extending above ground level. Most troubling to her neighbors was the depth. Margaret insisted on excavating exactly 8 feet down, measured from finished grade, when every experienced farmer in Hancock County knew that 4 to 5 feet provided adequate cold storage for root vegetables, preserved foods, and dairy products through the warmest months. Thomas Brennan, whose farm adjoined the Ashford property on the western boundary, found himself walking over to observe the construction with increasing frequency during late April. Brennan had farmed these Indiana fields for 28 years, survived the Civil War, and built his own root cellar in 1871 following specifications his father had used in Virginia. That cellar, dug to a sensible 4.5 feet, had served his family's preservation needs without complaint. That's 6 weeks she could be working her fields, he told his wife Ellen one evening, as they watched Margaret's sons haul another load of excavated earth. Root cellar at 4 feet does the job just fine. Been using mine for 20 years without trouble. Catherine Miller, the settlement's eldest German immigrant, and a woman whose practical wisdom commanded respect throughout the community, brought professional authority to the growing skepticism. Miller's family had built root cellars in Pennsylvania for 3 generations before moving west to Indiana in 1854. Her own cellar followed specifications refined through decades of European and American experience, a stone-lined chamber extending precisely 5 feet below ground. My family built root cellars in Pennsylvania for 3 generations, she declared to the assembled women at Sunday services. 5 feet is plenty. 8 feet is digging to China for no purpose. The mathematical burden of Margaret's design became impossible to ignore as April progressed toward May. Where standard root cellars required approximately $12 in materials and 2 weeks of construction time, Margaret's project demanded $47 for stone, lumber supports, and ventilation components. The 6 weeks of construction represented opportunity cost worth roughly $30 in delayed planting, bringing her total investment to $77. For a widow managing a farm with 3 children and limited resources, the expenditure appeared reckless. Samuel Ashford, Margaret's brother-in-law and a man who felt responsible for his deceased brother's family welfare, expressed his concerns with increasing directness as construction stretched into its 5th week. James left you that farm debt-free, he told Margaret during a tense conversation in early May. Now you're spending $47 on a hole in the ground when you've got 3 children to feed. What happens if this expensive experiment fails and you've wasted a month of planting time? Margaret's defense remained brief and cryptic, referencing knowledge sources unfamiliar to most Indiana farmers. Cold air settles, she explained to Samuel during one exchange. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. 8 feet puts you below the frost line year-round. My grandfather built ice houses in Pennsylvania using these principles. The explanation seemed reasonable in theory, but the practical reality of sacrificing $77 and $6 weeks during crucial planting season struck most neighbors as impractical experimentation that farm families operating on thin margins could not afford. By May 15th, Margaret had completed her sunken pantry while neighbors finished their spring planting and questioned her judgment. Then, June temperatures began climbing toward what would become the hottest summer in local memory, and Margaret began storing butter in her underground chamber, where temperatures would soon tell a very different story than conventional wisdom predicted. Early June brought the first sustained heat wave, 5 consecutive days with temperatures climbing to 88 through 92 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmth tested every cold storage system in Hancock County, revealing immediate differences between conventional construction and Margaret's deeper excavation. Thomas Brennan's root cellar, dug to a practical 4.5 feet following Virginia mountain specifications, registered temperatures of 62 to 65 degrees. Catherine Miller's stone-lined cellar, deeper than most at 5 feet, maintained 58 to 62 degrees. Both depths proved adequate for potatoes, onions, and root vegetables that could tolerate moderate coolness. Margaret's sunken pantry, measured at the 8-foot depth she had insisted upon, held steady at 52 to 54 degrees, a full 10-degree differential that her neighbors acknowledged but questioned. The temperature difference mattered most for butter, the commodity that dominated summer preservation concerns throughout rural Indiana. In 1889, butter sold for 22 to 25 cents per pound, an expensive product that average farm families produced in quantities of 15 to 20 pounds monthly from their dairy cows. Summer spoilage rates and standard storage reached 30 to 40%, translating to economic losses of $120 to $2,000 monthly, sums that represented significant money for families operating on limited cash incomes. The question facing the community was whether Margaret's 10-degree advantage justified her fourfold construction investment and 6 weeks of lost planting time. Margaret stored 12 pounds of freshly churned butter in her pantry on June 8th. Her neighbors stored theirs in conventional root cellars at the same time, creating an unintentional comparison that the community watched with growing interest. By the third day, the results became visible to anyone willing to observe. Brennan's butter, stored at 64 degrees, showed softening and early signs of rancidity, the characteristic off smell that indicated spoilage beginning. Miller's butter, maintained at 60 degrees, kept its shape but displayed surface sweating that suggested approaching deterioration. Margaret's butter, held at 53 degrees, remained firm and fresh with no detectable changes in texture or smell. Thomas Brennan dismissed the 3-day test with arguments that resonated throughout the skeptical community. It's only been 3 days, and June isn't even our hottest month, he insisted to neighbors at the general store. My butter lasts well enough in my cellar because I eat it before it spoils. That's how farm families have always managed. Catherine Miller acknowledged the temperature advantage, but questioned its value against the investment required. That extra 8 degrees doesn't justify $47 and 6 weeks of work, she told the women gathered after Sunday services. We've managed fine for generations with shallower cellars. Samuel Ashford raised the objection that carried the most weight among practical farmers. You're comparing fresh butter, he told Margaret directly. Everyone's butter is fine when it's fresh. Wait until July when real heat arrives. Then we'll see if your expensive hole was worth the cost. Margaret responded to the skepticism by introducing systematic testing unusual for frontier farmwives. She began taking daily temperature readings with a mercury thermometer, assessing butter freshness at 3-day intervals, and documenting storage performance in a leather-bound ledger, normally reserved for household accounts. Her testing expanded beyond butter to include milk, eggs, and fresh meat, creating a comprehensive record of preservation outcomes at different temperatures. The scientific approach impressed some neighbors, while striking others as unnecessary complexity for a simple farming task. By late June, Margaret explained her technical reasoning to curious neighbor women who visited to examine the pantry construction. Stone absorbs heat differently than air, she said, running her hand along the cool wall surface. At 8 feet, we're below the frost line where ground temperature stays constant year-round, regardless of surface conditions. The dual ventilation shafts bring cool air down while expelling warm air upward through natural convection. The stone lining provides thermal mass that stabilizes temperature even during heat spikes. The explanations made theoretical sense, but practical farmers remained unconvinced that theory justified such extraordinary expense. The community women acknowledged Margaret's pantry maintained cooler temperatures, but questions persisted through the final week of June. Was 10 degrees really worth 4 times the standard construction cost? Would the benefit hold during genuine summer heat rather than moderate June warmth? Could this simply be coincidence of an unusually mild early summer? What about the opportunity cost of construction time during planting season? By June 30th, Margaret's pantry had proven reliable through moderate conditions. But the skeptics were right about one crucial point. June wasn't the real test. July 1889 would bring temperatures that broke records, and Margaret's $47 investment would face conditions that would either vindicate her wisdom or prove her neighbors correct about wasteful experimentation. July 1889 became one of the hottest months in Midwest memory. Temperatures climbed above 95 degrees for 12 straight days, with the mercury reaching 103 degrees on July 12th. Overnight temperatures barely dropped below 75 degrees, offering no relief from the relentless heat. Drought conditions turned the earth hard and cracked, and food spoilage became a daily crisis for every farm family in Hancock County. The first week of July brought cascading failures in standard cold storage throughout the community. Thomas Brennan's root cellar, which had served reliably for 18 years, registered temperatures of 68 to 72 degrees instead of its normal 62 to 65. His butter spoiled within 2 days of storage, forcing the family to churn only what they could eat or sell immediately. By July 7th, Brennan had lost 180 in spoiled dairy products, and his eggs developed off odors after just 4 days in storage. Catherine Miller's deeper cellar performed better, but still struggled, holding at 64 to 67 degrees when it normally maintained 60. Her butter lasted 4 to 5 days before rancidity set in, forcing her to reduce dairy production to minimize waste. She began selling butter at market within 24 hours of churning, losing the flexibility to wait for better prices. The community-wide impact became severe as July's second week arrived. The local market flooded with butter that every farm family needed to sell before it spoiled. Prices collapsed from 24 cents per pound to 18 cents, meaning families lost money both to spoilage and to depressed market values. Meat preservation became nearly impossible, requiring families to consume dressed poultry within hours of butchering, rather than the usual 3 to 4 days. Thomas Brennan found himself churning butter at 5 in the morning and rushing to market by 7, accepting whatever price buyers offered because he had no choice. His family reduced dairy production, milking fewer cows to avoid creating butter they couldn't preserve or sell profitably. Margaret's sunken pantry maintained 54 to 56 degrees despite surface temperatures exceeding 100. The 46-degree difference between her storage temperature and the burning air above ground created preservation conditions that conventional storage couldn't approach. Her butter stayed fresh for 10 to 12 days. Eggs maintained quality for 2 weeks or longer. Fresh milk lasted 3 to 4 days instead of spoiling within 24 hours. Dressed poultry kept safely for 4 to 5 days, allowing the family to butcher on weekends and eat the meat through the following week. The visual contrast became impossible to ignore. Catherine Miller watched on July 10th as Margaret retrieved butter that had been stored for 8 days. "That butter looks like it was churned this morning," Miller said, examining the firm texture and fresh smell. "Mine turns by day 3, even in my stone-lined cellar. I don't understand how yours stays good so long." The answer lay in those crucial degrees of temperature difference that Margaret's extra depth provided. But the real proof appeared in the economic calculations that farm families understood instinctively. Between July 1st and July 15th, the Brennan family lost 1.92 in spoiled butter another 72 cents from selling at depressed market prices, and 45 cents in ruined eggs. Their total loss reached $3.09 in just 2 weeks, nearly half of what Margaret had spent on her entire pantry construction. Margaret experienced zero spoilage, maintained full dairy production, and could wait for market prices to recover before selling. Her net economic advantage exceeded $3 in 14 days, with 5 more weeks of summer remaining. July 18th brought 103-degree heat, the hottest temperature in local records. Standard root cellars reached 74 to 76 degrees, barely cooler than house interiors, and completely inadequate for preserving dairy products. Community butter production essentially stopped. Some families faced the devastating choice of selling dairy cows or dumping milk because they couldn't preserve the butter it produced. Margaret's pantry held steady at 56 degrees, still cool enough to keep butter fresh for over a week. The breaking point arrived on July 19th when Anna Brennan appeared at Margaret's door, carrying butter wrapped in cloth that had spoiled overnight. "May I buy space in your pantry?" she asked quietly. "I'll pay you a penny a pound per day." "We can't keep losing food like this." Thomas won't admit it, but we've lost nearly $5 this month. Margaret agreed to store the Brennan family's butter, but word of the request spread quickly through the community. By July 20th, 3 more families asked to rent storage space in the pantry that everyone had called wasteful just 3 months earlier. The expensive hole in the ground had become the most valuable food preservation system in the county, and the summer heat showed no signs of breaking. The late July meeting at the community Grange Hall shifted from scheduled business to an impromptu consultation session about cold storage. Thomas Brennan, who 3 months earlier had called Margaret's construction wasteful, stood before the assembled farmers with uncomfortable honesty. "I've lost $6.50 in spoiled food this summer," he said. "That's half of what Margaret spent building her pantry. I need to know if this design can work for my family before next summer arrives." Catherine Miller, whose professional masonry experience and German heritage had made her the community's authority on root cellar construction, acknowledged what the July heat had proven beyond dispute. "My cellar is stone-lined and deeper than most in this county," she told the gathering. "If even mine can't handle extreme heat, then conventional wisdom isn't sufficient anymore." Margaret explained the physics in terms that farmers without scientific training could grasp. "Temperature drops roughly 1 degree for every foot you go down into the earth," she said, "but only until you reach the frost line at 4 to 5 feet depth. Below that line, you enter ground that never freezes in winter and never heats in summer. At 8 feet, the earth temperature stays within 2 to 3 degrees year-round, holding steady around 52 to 54 degrees, regardless of what happens on the surface. That constant temperature is what preserves butter through the hottest weeks." The ventilation system proved equally critical to the pantry's success. Margaret walked her neighbors through the dual shaft design that made natural cooling possible without mechanical systems. The intake shaft on the north side brings cool air down into the space because cool air is denser and naturally falls, she explained. Warm air inside the pantry rises through the exhaust shaft on the south side. This convection happens continuously without any pumps or fans, but both shafts must extend at least 18 inches above ground level to function properly. The simplicity of the system appealed to farmers who understood that complexity meant more things that could break or require maintenance. Margaret opened her construction ledger to show the economic reality behind her investment. Materials had cost $47 for stone, lumber supports, and ventilation components. The 6 weeks of construction represented roughly $30 in lost planting time. Her total investment of $77 seemed enormous until compared against summer preservation value. Between July and August, she had prevented $5.76 in butter spoilage, gained $2.16 in better market timing by waiting for prices to recover, saved $1.80 in preserved eggs, and an estimated $3,000 in meat preservation. Her summer benefit totaled $12.72, meaning full investment recovery within 6 summers under normal conditions. The catastrophic heat of 1889 had simply accelerated the payback timeline while demonstrating the system's reliability under worst-case conditions. The on-site demonstrations at Margaret's pantry revealed construction details that verbal explanations couldn't convey. She showed neighbors how to select stone for proper thermal properties, checking each piece for density, and checking for fracture lines that could crack under repeated heating and cooling cycles. The selection process eliminated roughly 60% of available stones, explaining why her construction had taken so long. Foundation work required lime-based mortar rather than the simple clay and sand mixtures used in standard root cellars. The stronger mortar could withstand expansion stresses from the massive stone platform supporting 1,800 pounds of material. Ventilation shaft placement mattered critically, with the intake positioned on the north side, where it received the coolest air, and the exhaust on the south, where sun exposure helped draw warm air upward. Safety considerations emerged as neighbors contemplated sleeping arrangements and food storage in deep underground spaces. Margaret demonstrated her bedding system, showing how canvas and wool layers provided insulation while allowing beneficial temperature transfer. Surface temperatures of the stone walls measured 85 to 90 degrees after a hot day, warm enough for effective cooling but safe for direct contact through appropriate materials. She emphasized structural support during excavation, explaining that cave-ins presented the greatest danger during construction. Proper timber bracing and careful soil evaluation prevented accidents that could kill workers in seconds. By early August, 7 families had committed to construction projects. Thomas Brennan planned to begin digging in September, immediately after harvest finished. Catherine Miller asked whether she could deepen her existing 5-foot cellar to 8 feet, but Margaret advised against it. Excavating under an existing structure creates instability that could collapse the walls, she explained. Safer to build a new pantry and use your old cellar for different storage purposes. Samuel Ashford, Margaret's brother-in-law who had questioned her judgment so sharply in April, offered a public apology. "I owe you my regret for doubting your wisdom," he said. "You understood something the rest of us missed entirely. I'd like to build one before next summer if you'll consult on my construction." The knowledge Margaret shared throughout August would determine whether her innovation could spread beyond a single successful example or remain an isolated achievement that other families couldn't replicate without her direct guidance and experience. Thomas Brennan began excavation on September 10, 1889, following Margaret's specifications with methodical precision. The site measured 10 feet by 12 feet, and Brennan dug straight down toward the 8-foot depth that had proven critical during July's crisis. At 6 feet down, water began seeping through the clay soil, indicating a high water table that would flood the completed pantry during spring rains. Margaret examined the site and recommended relocating 30 feet east to higher ground where drainage would remain reliable year-round. Brennan started over without complaint, understanding that proper site selection mattered as much as correct depth. His construction required 5 weeks, faster than Margaret's original timeline, because he benefited from her learned techniques and guidance. Final cost reached $51, slightly higher than Margaret's expense due to the extra stone hauling from the relocated site. Catherine Miller attempted to deepen her existing 5-foot cellar during October, but the excavation created structural instability in walls that had been built to support only 5 feet of depth. Cracks appeared in the stonework after 2 days of digging, forcing Miller to abandon the deepening approach entirely. Margaret was right, Miller admitted to neighbors. Should have started fresh from the beginning instead of trying to modify existing construction. She built a separate pantry following Margaret's full specifications, completing the work in 6 weeks at a cost of $58. The wasted effort on the failed deepening project added frustration and expense, but Miller's professional pride demanded she master the technique that had proven superior to her traditional methods. Samuel Ashford and his brother Robert chose a collaborative approach, sharing construction costs by building a single large pantry measuring 14 feet by 12 feet to serve both families. The economies of scale reduced per family cost to $38, making the innovation accessible to families with tighter budgets. Construction required 7 weeks due to the larger excavation, but the shared labor and materials demonstrated how neighbors could adapt Margaret's design to their specific economic circumstances. By November, 3 completed pantries stood in Hancock County beyond Margaret's original, each one a testament to successful knowledge transfer from innovator to community. Winter 1889 to 1890 provided the first testing period for replicated designs. Temperature monitoring through December, January, and February revealed consistent performance across all 3 new pantries. Brennan's registered 50 to 52 degrees, actually running slightly cooler than Margaret's due to improved ventilation shaft placement he had discovered during construction. Miller's maintained 52 to 54 degrees, matching Margaret's performance exactly. The Ashford brothers' shared pantry held steady at 51 to 53 degrees, despite serving 2 families. All 3 maintained stable temperatures, while surface conditions dropped to 15 to 20 degrees during the coldest winter weeks. The winter storage benefits surprised everyone, including Margaret. Vegetables that typically froze in outdoor cellars or standard 4-foot storage remained unfrozen at the 8-foot depth. Root vegetables, including carrots, turnips, and potatoes, stayed fresher through February than anyone expected. Apples maintained their crispness into January when they normally softened by early December. Cured meats hung in the stable humidity without the excessive drying that plagued standard cellars. The Grange Hall secretary noted in community records that families had built cold storage for summer preservation, but discovered year-round food security benefits they hadn't anticipated. By May 1890, 4 more families began construction, based on the first year's demonstrated success. Word spread beyond Hancock County as 2 families from neighboring Harrison County traveled to observe the pantries and consult with Margaret about adapting the design to their soil conditions. Margaret's innovation was becoming a regional standard rather than a single family's unusual experiment. June 1890 brought normal summer temperatures without the extreme heat of the previous year, but all replicated pantries performed exactly as designed. Butter storage extended to 10 to 12 days, consistently across every family using the 8-foot depth. Community-wide butter spoilage rates dropped from 35% to under 5%, representing collective economic savings that transformed summer dairy management throughout the region. July 1890 delivered another heat wave, though less severe than 1889, with temperatures reaching 96 to 98 degrees for 1 week. The new sunken pantries maintained temperatures between 54 and 57 degrees, while standard root cellars struggled at 68 to 72 degrees. The clear performance differential repeated in the second summer, proving that Margaret's design worked reliably across varying weather conditions, rather than succeeding only during one catastrophic heat event. Thomas Brennan's family experienced 0 butter spoilage compared to the $6.50 they had lost during the previous July. Their increased dairy production, enabled by confidence in preservation capacity, generated additional income that exceeded their construction investment. Brennan's total economic benefit for summer 1890 reached $8.20, meaning his $51 pantry had paid for itself in under 2 summers of normal use. Catherine Miller's results showed similar economic vindication with $7.40 in measurable preservation value, plus extended garden produce storage that added unmeasured benefit to her family's food security. The Miller family began hosting Sunday gatherings where fresh butter availability through the hottest weeks impressed guests and elevated the family's social standing in ways that economic calculations couldn't capture. By August 1890, 11 families in Hancock County were using sunken pantries, and the community's collective summer food waste had dropped 60% from the 1889 baseline. The county fair in August featured Margaret as a speaker on modern cold storage methods. Her presentation drew over 40 attendees from 5 townships, and the agricultural extension agent documented the technique for wider distribution. The local newspaper ran an article titled, "Widow's Innovation Saves County Farmers Hundreds in Food Waste," providing regional publicity that would accelerate adoption beyond the immediate community. Thomas Brennan, speaking publicly at the fair, delivered the statement that completed his transformation from skeptic to advocate. 2 years ago, I called Margaret Ashford foolish for spending $47 on a hole in the ground, he said. I've since spent $51 on my own fool's hole, and it's the smartest investment I've made in 20 years of farming. By 1895, documented sunken pantries appeared throughout central Indiana in numbers that transformed Margaret Ashford's innovation from neighborhood curiosity to regional standard. Hancock County alone recorded 47 pantries built on the 8-foot depth specification, up from the single original structure Margaret had completed in 1889. Harrison County added 23 pantries, Shelby County 31, and Madison County 18. The design spread across the Illinois border and into eastern Ohio as farm families shared construction knowledge through family letters and county fair demonstrations. The collective economic impact reached measurable proportions, with average farm families reducing summer food waste by 40 to 55% and saving an estimated $200 to $300 annually in preserved food value. Design variations emerged throughout the 1890s as builders adapted Margaret's core principles to specific family needs and site conditions. An Indiana farmer developed a double-depth design in 1892 featuring 2 separate levels, with stairs landing at 6 feet for a winter vegetable storage zone holding 58 to 60 degrees, and a lower 8-foot chamber, maintaining maximum cooling at 52 to 54 degrees for summer dairy preservation. Ohio communities pioneered communal pantry models in 1893, where 3 to 5 families shared construction costs on larger excavations, measuring 20 feet by 16 feet. Divided interiors with locked sections gave each family private storage, while reducing individual costs to $25 to $30 instead of the $47 to $50 required for single-family construction. An Illinois variation combined a standard 6-foot cellar for bulk root vegetable storage, with an 8-foot cold room extension reserved for temperature-sensitive dairy products, balancing total cost against maximum cooling benefit. The integration with other preservation technologies revealed unexpected synergies. Families operating both ice houses and sunken pantries discovered complementary functions, using ice houses for extreme cooling needs, like ice cream production, while relying on sunken pantries for consistent daily preservation without consuming harvested ice. The combination reduced winter ice harvest requirements by 40%, while providing year-round food security. Farms with spring houses added sunken pantries as backup systems during drought years when water flow became unreliable, creating dual preservation capacity that worked regardless of weather conditions. Purdue University Agricultural Extension documented the technique in a 1902 bulletin titled "Cold Storage for the Farm Family," crediting Margaret Ashford as the originator and standardizing design specifications for Indiana soil and climate conditions. The academic recognition brought formal legitimacy to what had begun as a widow's practical experiment. County agricultural agents during the 1910s actively promoted sunken pantry construction through demonstration builds at county fairs and cost-sharing programs that helped families afford materials during the Progressive era's farm improvement initiatives. The technology became integrated into modern farming education programs that extension agents delivered throughout rural communities. Margaret Ashford served as informal consultant for construction projects through the 1890s, traveling to neighboring counties when families requested guidance on site selection or ventilation design. She became a respected community elder by 1900, known throughout the region for practical wisdom that had transformed food preservation methods. Her three children successfully farmed the family land using her preservation techniques, and the original 1889 pantry remained functional through the 1940s. Margaret passed away in 1912 at age 65, and her obituary in the local newspaper described her as a pioneer of modern food preservation whose innovation had saved farm families thousands of dollars collectively. The arrival of mechanical refrigeration during the 1910s created a technology overlap period that lasted decades in rural areas. Electric refrigerators appeared in urban homes by 1915, but rural electrification wouldn't reach most Indiana farms until the 1930s and 1940s. Sunken pantries remained the primary preservation method for the majority of farm families through the 1920s, with an estimated 500 to 700 structures operating across the central Indiana and Ohio region by 1920. Economic reality favored the older technology for most families. A 1920 electric refrigerator cost $600 to $900, equivalent to roughly $9,000 to $13,500 in modern purchasing power, while sunken pantry construction still required only $50 to $70 in materials. Mechanical refrigeration remained financially inaccessible to average farm families until the 1930s at the earliest. Peak usage occurred around 1920, followed by a gradual decline as rural electrification expanded through the 1930s and 1940s. Changing food systems shifted families away from home dairy production towards store-bought products, reducing the preservation challenges that had made sunken pantries essential. Suburban development replaced farmland throughout the region, and most pantries were filled in or destroyed as agricultural land converted to residential use. Many structures saw final active use during World War II for Victory Garden storage, before being permanently abandoned as modern refrigeration became universal. An estimated 30 to 40 intact sunken pantries survive today in the central Indiana and Ohio region. Most have been filled in or repurposed as storm shelters, but several appear on the National Register of Historic Places as examples of agricultural innovation. Margaret's original 1889 pantry remains partially intact and has been documented by the State Historical Society as the originating structure of a technology that spread throughout the Midwest. The innovation's historical significance lies not in inventing underground storage, an ancient technique, but in the systematic application of thermal physics to achieve precise temperature control, the successful transfer of technical knowledge across communities, and the economic democratization of effective food preservation for average farm families. Margaret Ashford understood what her skeptical neighbors initially missed, that small differences in temperature achieved through precise application of natural physics could create dramatic economic advantages. Her willingness to invest more initially, digging deeper than conventional wisdom suggested, and spending more than standard practice demanded, delivered returns that shallow cellars could never match. The numbers told the story that mattered most. $47 invested in 1889, 8 feet of excavation depth, 52 to 54 degrees of stable temperature, 10 to 12 days of butter preservation compared to 2 to 3 days in standard storage, 40 to 55% reduction in food waste, 500 families adopting the technology within 30 years. Summer 1889 began with neighbors laughing at her fool's sunken pantry. By 1920, historical surveys documented Margaret Ashford's innovation as one of the most successful grassroots food preservation technologies in Midwest agricultural history, saving farm families thousands of dollars collectively and improving rural food security for 3 decades. The woman they called foolish for digging too deep had understood something profound. Sometimes the best solutions require going further than conventional wisdom suggests. investing more than standard practice demands, and trusting knowledge that others dismiss until results prove undeniable.